By far the most common myth about audio products today is the claim that inexpensive suitcase-style record players from brands like Crosley and Victrola will destroy your records.
Kids are going to buy these cruddy turntables, they'll play Dark Side of the Moon 5 times, and then the grooves will all be chewed up, and they'll say, this is a stupid hobby, why did I get into this?
But the second most common myth about audio products today is the claim that there's only one cassette player mechanism being manufactured anymore, and it's made, or at least was designed, by a company called Tanishin.
People who see this will immediately know that it's the Tanishin mechanism, and it's actually the only mechanism available now.
But I don't blame them, because it's a myth that even some of the companies who are designing and selling cassette players today have perpetuated.
My name is Romain Poudruche, and I'm the founder of We Are Everyone. Everyone in the world right now is using the same mechanism. Everyone, because there's only one available.
I assume they're specifically talking about the mechanism used in handheld Walkman-style portable cassette players. Because even the novice should be able to tell that there's something completely different between the full logic, remote-controlled mechanisms found in this new TIAC cassette deck and this basic clunky slot-loading mechanism found in the groove-chewing Victrola. And allegedly, the presence of a curlicue-shaped spring is an indication that a device is using the mechanism they're talking about.
That is the telltale spring. So yes, this is using the Tanishin cassette mech.
If I peer inside this new VeraVox's CAS 8810 cassette player, it does indeed have a spring which looks like that. Two of them, in fact. But the mechanism of this new Jensen SCR75 cassette player looks totally different. It is much more made of plastic, and instead of having a spring which coils around the capstan, it has longitudinal springs which operate the buttons. And this new DigitNow BR630 has a feature most people think isn't being made anymore. Auto reverse. Going forwards, going backwards, going forwards, going backwards. I discovered a new toy. Going forwards, going backwards. So what is going on here? Well, since I'm supposed to be an authority on this sort of thing, I thought it's time to investigate.
I've kind of been corrected by videos from V Westlife, who's investigated this even more.
Let's start with the Jensen, which unusually contains a line output jack as well as a headphone jack, but disappointingly, whereas the cassette player part of it is stereo, the built-in FM radio tuner is only mono. Notice this MET on the back of the Jensen. That indicates it is made by a company called Met Industrial Limited, which is based in Hong Kong and does their manufacturing in China. And they are one of the main suppliers to Spectra Merchandising, the company who owns the Jensen brand name. As mentioned, it is a very simple, mostly plastic, playback-only mechanism. There's no recording version of this, with no rewind either. But it does have the good kind of auto stop, which stops as soon as the take-up reel stops spinning, which means it will not eat your tape in case it gets stuck to the pinch roller. That gives it the unexpected bonus of having auto stop during fast forward, not just during playback. And here is that mechanism, a very simple thing, almost entirely made of plastic, with the aforementioned springs, which the buttons operate. But it does have a stereo head and a metal bracket for the pinch roller. Because there is no rewind, the supply reel just sits on a fixed plastic post. The back is again almost entirely made of plastic, but it does have a metal flywheel, and it does have a clutch in the mechanism. Although in the Jensen they cheapened out by only giving it a plastic flywheel. Bummer. And this mechanism dates back to... 1999. Yes, 1999. That's when various brands of inexpensive Walkman-type cassette players introduced it as what they called a new, thinner design or a slimline design. Not because the mechanism itself is necessarily any thinner than the ones that came before it, such as this one from a mid-90s Ultronic cassette player, but because the overall smaller size of the mechanism allowed them to rearrange the other components in the player, such as the batteries and the circuitry, to have an overall thinner product. And here's an RCA RP1804A personal stereo cassette player from 2003, which contains that same mechanism. It's pretty easy to identify. Whenever you see stop and fast forward next to each other, no rewind, and a large play button underneath. And here was an Encore Technology tape-to-USB cassette player from 2013, which used to contain the same mechanism until I removed it. And that same mechanism is still in production today in 2026, although the only cassette player I've been able to find which still uses it is the Jensen SCR75. And if you want to buy just that mechanism by itself, it's all over your favorite online shopping sites like AliExpress, Amazon, and eBay. Just look for MCT7 Movement and you'll find it. Just be warned that most of the ones I've seen for sale are equipped with a mono head, not stereo. And there was actually one model of mono cassette player containing that mechanism, the Durabrand 822, sold by Walmart in 2007. It looks very similar to the previous model of cassette player they sold, the 820M, except whereas that model says on the back of the package, plays all stereo cassette tapes, on the 822 they changed that to just read, plays all cassette tapes, no mention of stereo. Most modern auto-reverse cassette players are based on the same Super USB cassette capture design that's been around since 2011, including this new Bertowick JL101, which has a clear cover but is otherwise identical, including the same weird sideways opening door and the flimsy battery compartment cover that you're almost guaranteed to lose. But looking closer, you can see it has dual cap stands and pinch rollers and a 4-track stereo head. So yes, this is a stereo auto-reverse cassette player that you can buy new today. On the top you get buttons for play, fast forward, rewind, and stop. And as expected, when it reaches the end of the tape, it will automatically reverse and start playing the opposite side. And you get a button to manually reverse it if you so choose, and a control to select whether you want it to auto-reverse infinitely or to play both sides of the tape and then stop. The back cover is clear as well, so you can see the operation of the mechanism, including the dual counter-rotating flywheels. These auto-reverse Super USB cassette capture players are made by Shenzhen Forward Video Technology Company Limited, better known as EasyCap, and if you order thousands of them, they cost less than $12 each. And here is the new DigitNow BR630 with auto reverse that I showed earlier. A bit larger than the other one, but it adds a built-in radio tuner, a built-in speaker, and it can also record. The box says designed in Germany, but I bet the only part that's actually designed in Germany is the box. These little radio auto reverse cassette recorders are actually made by Shenzhen Hanjiangda Electronic Company Limited, and if you order them in bulk, they cost about $13 each. The radio tuner has pretty good reception and sound quality on both AM and FM, and the built-in speaker gets surprisingly loud. It even has a pull-out antenna, and it does a passable job of recording from the radio tuner.
Maybe a thunder shower well north of the city in the afternoon. A high 76, partly sunny, breezy Friday. Again up to 76, a little cooler Saturday maybe. It also has a built-in microphone for recording dictation.
but unfortunately it does a better job of picking up noise from the tape mechanism than your voice, and there is no input for an external microphone. And a bigger letdown with this model is that it is not stereo. Both the radio tuner and cassette are mono, including through the headphone jack. It has a dual mono tape head, which I didn't even know was a thing. And next to it is a little permanent magnet erase head which engages when you press record. Unfortunately, it doesn't do a very good job of erasing the tape, so it's best to record on a blank tape. And you have to be careful because there is no recording lockout tab. It just lets you record on anything, even a pre-recorded music tape. And because that erase head has to come before the recording head, it can only record in the forward direction. If it either reaches the end of the tape during recording, or if you try to manually switch sides during recording, it will just immediately stop. A few years ago, Techmoan reviewed a cassette recorder that looks almost identical but is not auto-reverse. It contains the same mechanism, but they installed a one-way head and disabled the auto-reverse function of it.
The presence of two flywheels would suggest that this device is able to play in either direction. Now, of course, the one I have here can't do auto-reverse. The tape head would need to be able to play either side of the tape for that to happen, which this one can't. So it turns out that this device can be spec'd up to be an auto-reverse unit, and it seems like much of the mechanism that enabled that feature still remains inside.
And here is that auto-reverse player mechanism taken out of one of these USB cassette players. Almost entirely made of metal, and I like how the play button is directly pushing on the head carrier, so they're really trying to save space with this thing. On the reverse side, there's just one belt and a complicated array of clockwork-like gears to operate the mechanism. I'll push the button to change sides, and you can see the way that works. As for the history of this auto-reverse mechanism, I have been able to trace it back to the early 2000s, when it was used in inexpensive auto-reverse players like the Curtis RS-45, Jensen SCR-70M, and GPX C3142.
You can see the two capstans that support auto-reverse.
And if you want to buy one of these auto-reverse mechanisms by itself, you can find them on all your favorite sites. Even Walmart sells it on their online store. But unfortunately this time there's no consistent model number or name for it. You just gotta know what you're looking for. And again, a lot of them are equipped with mono heads, so watch out for that. Here are various cassette players and recorders that you can buy new today that are using what is often claimed to be the last cassette mechanism being made, even though I've already proved that is not true. One is mono and includes a built-in radio tuner and speaker, while all the rest are stereo and do not. Some have the buttons in one row, while others have them in two rows. And some can record while others are playback only. The red button on the Mexel is stop, not record. The mechanical operation is very basic and straightforward with no unexpected quirks or features. You get buttons for stop, fast forward, rewind, play, and sometimes record. You get auto stop when it reaches the end of the tape during playback or recording, but not during fast forwarding or rewinding. As for who actually makes these things, a look at the FCC certification reveals the manufacturer of the Mexel MXCP P100 to be Huizhou Huipu Electronic Company Limited. They also manufacture the We Are Rewind WE001 cassette player, and a look at the company's profile reveals that they sell their products directly under the Panda and Tamashi names. No video this time, but here's a photo of one of their workers assembling a cassette player. And here's one of their workers testing them, and it looks like their wow and flutter meter has a tick mark pointing to 0.4% on the scale, so that must be their internal quality control limit. If it's any worse than that, it's not going to pass the test. The Toshiba Oryx Walkie AXW10, however, is made by a different OEM, Carwee Electronics Development Limited. And here is that mechanism everybody's talking about. The frame that holds it together is plastic, but all the parts that actually move and make it work are metal. And likewise, this one has a metal flywheel. The basic mechanism is the same regardless if all the buttons are in one row or are split up onto two rows, although obviously some of the linkages are different. And just as this is not the only cassette mechanism still being made, they're not all coming from the same factory either. For example, this one says XH-E, and this other one says ZJ-B. And the one shown in the video by The Verge says HS-7. So there are various different factories all making these mechanisms. The modern handheld cassette recorder mechanism dates back to 2014, when Shenzhen Skywin Electronic Company Limited began selling cassette recorders using it. They're the company infamous for making those cheap suitcase-style record players, like the one I showed at the very beginning of the video. And if you want to buy one of these mechanisms, you guessed it, they're widely available, but no consistent nomenclature for them other than referring to them as a movement instead of a mechanism. Named after their founder, Shinsaku Tanaka, Tanashin Denki Company Limited of Tokyo, Japan, was the world's leading manufacturer of tape mechanisms. And if you had an inexpensive Walkman-type cassette player in the 80s or 90s with 3 buttons in a row, play, fast forward, and stop, with no rewind, it was almost guaranteed to use this mechanism, the Tanishin TN6. But in 2019, Kilobyte magazine quoted Marcelo Inoue from Tanishin's audio business sales department as saying their production of cassette mechanisms stopped over 10 years ago, in 2009. So anything made since then is not using a mechanism manufactured by Tanishin. And judging by their website going offline in 2022, the company now seems to be totally defunct. And as for the theory that all the cassette mechanisms made today are clones or knockoffs of Tanishin's designs, I've been scouring old archives of their website and any other information I can find, and that does not seem to be true. Back when they were still in active production, Tanishin had a list of all the cassette mechanisms they were manufacturing, 3 of which are listed as being for stereo headphone cassette players, the TN44, TN8S, and TN9X, but none of them are a match to any of the 3 mechanisms being made today. I also found this low-res picture of the cassette mechanisms they were making in 1997, and even if I squint, I only see a couple of vague similarities, no exact matches. I then looked through their patents, including one from 1989 for a Walkman-type auto-reverse cassette mechanism, but aside from having a similar layout of the motor, belt, and flywheels, it does not match the one being made today. Tanishin also had a patent from 1990 for a tape recorder with a reduced thickness, but the details in it are too scant to confirm anything other than the belt, motor, and flywheel arrangement being similar to the mechanism being made today. However, this Walkman-type mechanism being made today does look an awful lot like a downsized version of this other mechanism being made today, which itself is a knockoff of the Tanishin TN21 mechanism that was found in countless boomboxes and stereo systems in the 80s and 90s. So I guess you could describe this new mechanism found in many Walkman-type players today as a downsized derivative of a knockoff of a Tanishin mechanism. But remember, this is not the only mechanism being used today in Walkman-type players. These 2 other ones seem to bear no resemblance to anything that ever came out of Tanishin's factory. And I said I would only cover Walkman-type cassette mechanisms in this video, but I will give an honorable mention to this slot-loading cassette mechanism that you often find stuck into the side of inexpensive record players like this Victrola. It is called the X301 Movement, and it is a near exact copy of the Tanishin TN301N mechanism designed for use in car stereos. And thanks to Huijiao DoSound Electronics Company Limited, I found a few brief clips of it being assembled. I think the mechanism in any modern cassette player or recorder is the subject of undeserved scorn, because ultimately it bears little influence on the sound quality you hear coming out of your speakers or headphones. The most important part of a cassette player is actually the motor, because just like the motor of a turntable, if it can't hold a steady speed or is generating unwanted noise, it's going to ruin your whole experience. And just as Tanishin mechanisms used to be the standard that everybody used, Mabuchi motors used to be the industry standard except for companies like Matsushita who were large enough to make their own motors in-house. Specifically in handheld cassette recorders and players, this one, the Mabuchi RF-300C-14270. But as Mabuchi confirmed by email in 2021, they discontinued final production of those motors almost 10 years ago. So on anything made since the early 2010s, even if it uses exactly the same part number as a Mabuchi motor, it was not made by them. It's a knockoff, such as this one by Chi-Zun, or this one by XH. And especially on these auto-reverse players, poor quality motors are the source of a lot of problems, such as unstable speed and electronic noise generated by the motor leaking into the audio, as Tony from the Cassette Comeback complained about.
This has got a stereo head. This is a stereo auto-reverse head, and this is a decent mech. It's a decent mech with a decent head. There's just one big problem with it, and that's this. The motor. It just interferes with the entire audio circuit, and it crackles and buzzes, and it doesn't matter what's coming off this head, because that thing is just completely destroying the sound. If they'd actually just, listen to it themselves and spent a bit long saying, alright, how do we isolate this? How do we make the circuitry better for this to not sound crap? This would be a half-decent little Walkman. Yeah, it looks cheap, but it would sound alright because the mech itself and the head seem decent.
Thankfully, some companies have done exactly what Tony suggested and added extra grounding to dissipate the electrical noise generated by the motor. For example, in this We Are Rewind player, they added ground wires going from the motor to the circuitry and from the motor to the metal case of the player. They're also using the one supplier which seems to be producing pretty good quality motors these days, which is TRW. Another thing that helps is to add a metal flywheel, but only if it's properly balanced. And that's another big problem with modern cassette players, unbalanced flywheels. For example, in this Orex walkie player, if I rub my fingernail against the flywheel as it's playing, you can hear how eccentric it is. Same thing with the Digit Now auto reverse recorder. Having dual flywheels isn't going to help when they're both off balance, especially the one on the left. I'd actually rather have a plastic flywheel like in the Jensen than an off balance metal flywheel. At least then it won't be hurting more than it helps. Some new cassette players are now using large copper flywheels to reduce the wow and flutter. But again, that only helps if the flywheel is properly balanced. Otherwise, it can actually make things worse. And they're not the best at getting the speed and head azimuth properly calibrated at the factory. Although, to be honest, that was true with many vintage Walkmans too. Which gets me onto my final rant. Let me summarize the complaints that are often levied against new personal stereo cassette players. They're big and heavy. They have a clunky mechanism with stiff buttons. They have high wow and flutter. The sound wobbles when you shake them. And even when sitting still, their sound quality is mediocre at best. They lack useful features like Dolby noise reduction, automatic music search, bass boost, adjustable EQ, and so forth. And the batteries don't last very long. Congratulations! You've just described the original Sony Walkman and many of the models which followed it in the 80s and 90s. Unless you were rich enough to afford a really high-end model which cost hundreds of dollars even back in the 1980s, these things were never as good as you remember or have been led to believe. And as for this recent trend of people violently shaking a cassette player and using the result of that as proof of it being bad, let me replay a rant I featured in a recent video. Now you may have seen some people shake a cassette player like a paint mixer, and of course the sound is going to wobble if you pull a stunt like that, even on a Sony Walkman with an anti-rolling system. Cassette players just weren't designed to be shaken like this. Any cassette player is going to have wobbly sound when you do that. But if you're just walking or jogging, it's fine. So even with this $35 Verivox's player, you'll have no problem getting your steps in. So I just wanted to debunk the myth that there's only one cassette mechanism being made anymore, and it is what is holding back modern Walkman type players in terms of their sound quality. That simply is not true. Any of the 3 different mechanisms currently being manufactured and used in these types of players can be used to make a good quality player. It just depends on the quality of the motor, the flywheels, and the audio circuitry they put into these things. Even this slot loading mechanism could be used to make a pretty good sounding cassette player.